Hello and welcome to another summary of what we looked at in church this morning in Ballymagurney. We're continuing on in our studies in the life of Joseph, and we're looking this afternoon at an insight into conscience, because here in Genesis chapter 42, Joseph, he is now before his brothers. His brothers have come down to Egypt. They are now in the time of famine, and they have heard that there is corn in Egypt, and so they come to Joseph. They don't realise who he is at this stage, to buy corn. And Joseph, he deals with them. He deals with their wrongdoing, their sin of some 20 to 22 years previous, whenever of course they threw him into the pit and eventually sold him and so on. So he deals with their conscience. That's what we really want to think about today, an insight into conscience. In Genesis 42 verse 7, we read of a summary of this. We read that Joseph saw his brethren. He knew them, but made himself strange unto them, and spake roughly unto them. And he said unto them, Whence come ye? And they said, From the land of Canaan, to buy food. Of course, it speaks there of him speaking roughly unto them. Robert Southey was a poet of a bygone day. And in one of his poems, he writes about the Inchcape Bell. Now, the Inchcape Bell, it was a bell attached to a buoy, and of course it was off one of the rough seas in Scotland, or off one of the harbours in Scotland. Essentially, the task of this bell attached to the buoy was whenever ships were coming into harbour, as of course it was rough and stormy, this bell would make a noise, and it would channel the ship accordingly into the harbour. But on one occasion, an old drunken sailor, he fell out with the inhabitants of the village, the town, and he actually cut the bell from the buoy. And so he wanted essentially anybody who was coming into the harbour, he wanted to do damage to them. They would miss the harbour and maybe land on the rocks. But several months later, after this old drunken sailor did this, in his tale of the Inchcape Bell, Robert Southey, he writes of this old captain, and he himself is coming into the harbour, looking for the harbour, and he forgets himself. He's listening out for that sound of the bell. Of course, he fails to realise that he himself has cut the bell previously, and he actually ends up with the ship tragically wrecked and ruined on the rocks. He misses the channel, and he misses the harbour, and he ends up shipwrecked on the rocks. So what had happened there is that things have come full circle for him. And here in Genesis chapter 42, we find the incidents of a bygone day, of some 21 or 22 years previously. These incidents have now come full circle with Joseph's brothers. Chapter 37, we saw Joseph as a faithful teenager, and we saw that in spite of his faithfulness to the Lord and faithfulness to even his father, his earthly father, yet Joseph was placed in prison and eventually sold to slave traders from Midian. And eventually ends up in Egypt. We see that in Genesis chapter 39. But we sort of forget about his brothers. But here, incidents of, as I have said, come full circle. Now, his brothers, they're facing famine. The famine that Joseph has predicted has now come to pass. They're in the 7 years of leanness, the 7 years of famine. And here are Joseph's brothers. They're actually standing before him in Genesis chapter 42. And they're seeking corn from him, seeking bread, seeking food. But here we read in the verse that we have just read, verse 7, we read Joseph speaking roughly to his brothers, or to his brethren. Here, the incidents of 20 odd years previously are coming back full circle. The Bible tells us in Numbers 32 in the verse 23, be sure your sin will find you out. The Bible tells us in the book of Galatians that whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. Galatians chapter 6. And here the seeds of sin that were sown some 21 years previously, by his brothers. They're now coming back to hunt him. And here, as Joseph's brothers are before him, we actually get an insight into the workings of conscience, or an insight into the inside. I remind you this morning that no matter what you do, no matter what you try to cover up, try to forget, in terms of deeds done in the past, they will always come back. God always has a way of bringing things full circle. God always has a way of bringing the chickens home to roost, so to speak. God always has a way of unearthing those skeletons buried in the closet. And perhaps you've thought that you've got away with something 10, 15, 20, 30 years previously. Here we're being taught this lesson that our sin always finds us out. God always has a way of bringing things full circle in order to deal with us and speak to us. And here, this is what we want to think about this morning. We want to think about Joseph as he proves, or as he deals with his brothers, and as we think about their conscience. So I want to look today at an insight into conscience. The first thing I think we see here in terms of Joseph's brothers, or his brethren as they're called here, is that their conscience was abandoned. Their conscience was abandoned. In verse 13, Joseph's brothers are before him, and we read that they said, "Thy servants are 12 brethren, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. And behold, the youngest is this day with our father, and one is not." So here's Joseph's brothers, and they're before him. They're literally standing face to face with him. Now at this stage they do not know who he is. He doesn't reveal himself, his identity, to chapter 45. We'll get to that in the weeks to come. But they are before him. But it's very, very interesting how they speak to Joseph. There are 10 of the brothers here. They have left Benjamin behind, who was the youngest. But little do they know they're actually before their brother, Joseph. But in speaking of their brother, Joseph, to Joseph, providentially, in verse 13 they say this. They say this, "Behold, the youngest is this day with our father, and one is not." One is not. They're actually saying to Joseph that one is dead. What they're really saying to Joseph is that we have 11, there's 11 of us, and there used to be another one, but he's now dead. Now the amazing thing about it is that I believe this is showing Joseph here, and this is showing you, that they have abandoned, Joseph's brothers have abandoned all feeling for what they have done 20 years ago. Let's not forget, in chapter 37, at one stage they were actually contemplating killing Joseph. The suggestion is made by one of the brothers, why don't we just kill him? This rebel rouser, this upstart with his fancy multicoloured coat, this favourite son of our father, why don't we just get rid of him and kill him? But of course they compromise, and they decide, well, we'll pretend that an animal has come and has killed him, and we'll dip his coat in blood, and we'll go back to Jacob, and we'll say to your dad that he's dead, but we'll just sell him off to Egyptian slave traders or Midianite slave traders. So they come before their father and they lie to him. They barefaced lie to him. They say to Jacob, look, Joseph is now dead. It's a blatant lie. Jacob, of course, is heartbroken, and this plunges Jacob into 22 years of despair. Jacob never really gets over this. He's a broken man. But in coming now before Joseph, I believe that they're showing him that whilst they perhaps may have been remorseful at the start, and perhaps as they told Jacob, look, Joseph's now dead, we don't really know what happened to him, and told them that lie and spun that yarn in chapter 37, perhaps they would have been remorseful. Perhaps there would have been something inside them that, as they saw Jacob's reaction, as they saw how heartbroken he was, undoubtedly they knew that Jacob loved Joseph. They would have been in some way shaken by this, or broken-hearted by all of this. But now they just dismiss it. One is not. One is not. One's as good as gone. And they actually, I believe, they're showing that they believe their own lie. One is dead. Now they watched Joseph sail off into the distance. They watched him go with these Midianite slave traders. They don't know what's happened to Joseph. And here are 10 brothers, and they're saying that one is dead, even though he is not. They're sweeping the whole thing under the carpet. They have abandoned their conscience, which perhaps previously, when they first committed the act, that the crime would have been stirred, would have been tender. Now it's just one is not. And they show no remorse for the wrongdoings of 20 odd years previously. This can happen to you, my friend. Whenever you do something, we all sin, we all transgress and break God's law, and we are all full of iniquity. You know, whenever we commit sin, God sometimes puts his finger upon that sin. And we're tender when he first speaks. But sometimes with the passing of time and no seeming consequences from that sin, sometimes your conscience has the tendency to become stiffened, toughened. You perhaps have done something years previously, and because God hasn't struck you down, or there have been no seemingly terrible consequences from that act, that you kind of just dismiss it. You abandon conscience. Maybe this is even, perhaps more generally, we could apply this to you who are not yet a Christian. God speaks to you and he shows you your sin. And there was a time when you trembled. There was a time when you feared God. There was a time when you knew that God was speaking to you. But now, whenever God's voice speaks to you, it's as if he's not speaking. All because you've abandoned and stiffened your conscience. The once soft conscience can become a seared and stiff conscience. Paul writes to Timothy and he states that there are false teachers. 1 Timothy chapter 4, and they had their conscience seared with the hot iron. And in the original Greek, the phrase there, seared with the hot iron, it's referring to the individual or the animal being branded. Of course, as that hot implement is applied to the skin, what happens? It actually sears the skin in the branding, and that skin becomes so tough that actually nerve endings are killed. There's no feeling at all. And Paul takes that image. He states, look, there are individuals in this world and their conscience is like that. It's tough. It's beyond feeling. It's past feeling. Maybe that's you today, my friend. Outside of God, outside of Jesus Christ, God used to speak to you and now you felt it. But now your conscience is seared. Now you've abandoned the speaking voice of God. Now you have suppressed his wooings, suppressed his speaking voice. This is what happened to Joseph's brothers. Now there was no seeming consequences for the selling of their brother. And so they just put it to the back of the mind. Their conscience was abandoned. I want you to see secondly then their conscience was alerted. Their conscience was alerted. In verse 7 of chapter 42, we read that Joseph saw his brethren, and he knew them, made himself strange to them, and spake roughly to them, said to them, whence come ye? And he said, from the land of Canaan, to buy food. Towards the end of chapter 41, you find the famine that Joseph has predicted coming to pass, those 7 lean years. And of course, as he also predicted, Egypt then, it grows, it flourishes because they have stored away food. And Jacob, remember, still in Canaan, still in Israel land, he hears of this. He hears of the fact that there is corn in Egypt. And he says to his sons, there's corn in Egypt. Go to Egypt and get corn, get food for us. We need food. We're in the midst of a famine. And in chapter 42, verse 1, as soon as the issue of Egypt is mentioned, it seems that Joseph's brothers look at each other. They are horrified. And I say that because in chapter 42, verse 1, Jacob asks his brothers, why look ye so one upon another? Why look ye so one upon another? He sees them looking at each other. As soon as the topic of Egypt is mentioned, they look at each other horrified. Egypt. Egypt. All of a sudden, those incidents of 20 years come back to them. All of a sudden, they begin to remember Joseph. Perhaps they're thinking, whatever happened to Joseph? We know that we sold him to Midianite slave traders. We know they were heading to Egypt. I wonder what happened to your brother. Did he die? Is he still alive? God is then speaking to Joseph's brothers here, and he uses providence to speak to them. He uses people to speak to them as well, because whenever they're before Joseph, we read here in verse 7 that Joseph spake roughly to them. Joseph, he speaks to them, he deals with them, he gives it to them straight. He also uses pain, because in this chapter, in verse 9, he firstly accuses his brothers of being spies, and he imprisons them. All 10 of them. Now eventually he lets 9 of them go back, but he asks Judah to remain. And when they go back, the command is given to bring Benjamin. Of course, Joseph and Benjamin, they were blood brothers. They had the same mother. Always had that special bond with Benjamin. So I want you to see here that God, he speaks to Joseph's brothers, and he uses the providence of a famine. He uses people because he uses Joseph, and he uses the pain of them being imprisoned. And as they are imprisoned, we read in verse 21 that they said one to another, "We are verily guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the anguish of his soul when he besought us, and we would not hear. Therefore is this distress come upon us." Therefore is this distress come upon us. God uses these means, and now they recognize their guilt concerning their brother. All of a sudden, that abandoned conscience, where they have put the whole issue of their wrongdoing to Joseph for 20 years to the back of their mind, now we're guilty concerning our brother. Their conscience is alerted. And my friend, this is how God speaks to you. As he spoke to Joseph's brothers, through providence, through people, and through pain, this is how God speaks to you. Job says, "God speaketh once, yea twice, yet man perceiveth it not." Maybe God's been speaking to you. Maybe it's been the providence of COVID-19. Maybe there have been incidents that have happened. There's been situations in your life that have fallen out as a result of COVID-19 in terms of hardship, in terms of family issues. Maybe it's a loss of job, whatever it might be. God, he uses providence. He uses pain. He brings pain along your way to speak to you, to awaken that abandoned conscience. Perhaps you find this. You've had time to spare in lockdown. You've had time to spare, and you've maybe been listening to things online or the internet. Maybe you've been listening even to these recordings. And God has begun to challenge you about your life of sin. He's begun to challenge you perhaps about things that you've done in the past. And perhaps you're like Joseph's brothers. We're verily guilty. We're guilty concerning our brother. This is how God speaks to you. Sometimes even brings people along our way. Maybe you've bumped into someone and they're in work, they're a Christian. Maybe they've been taking a bold stand. Maybe you've been reading things online by a particular individual or particular church. God, he speaks through providence, through pain, and through people. You go through the Bible, you'll find this. Think of the providence of Jonah. Jonah found that even though he's in the midst of the Mediterranean Sea, God providentially sent a storm. Think of pain. Think of Samson. Samson thought he could do it all without the Lord. And it wasn't until Samson lost his eyesight that he then really was a wonderful instrument in the hands of God in the true sense. Think of Peter. There he is. He's denied the Lord, and he's just warming his hands by the fire. And what happens? A little maid, a little girl, she says, "You were one of the disciples." And he denies the Lord. He uses a person. God uses providence, pain, and people to speak to you. Maybe I trust that this has been your lot, and maybe this is even your lot now. God is just stirring up those smouldering embers of your conscience, and he's challenging you. So Joseph's brothers, their conscience was abandoned, and then it was alerted. Once they lastly here, it was appeased. Their conscience was appeased. In verse 21, we read, "They said one to another, We are guilty concerning our brother. We saw the anguish of his soul when he besought us, and we would not hear. Therefore is this distress come upon us. They recognize their guilt here. They freely confess, look, we're guilty concerning our brother. The reason that we're in this prison right now, that they actually believe that the reason they're going through this particular hardship is solely down to what they've done to their brother 21 years ago. They recognize their wrongdoing and they confess it. That's what they're doing here in verse 21 of chapter 42. They're confessing, look, we're guilty. We're guilty. This is our fault. And they understand that the punishment that they're currently ensuing is because of previous deeds done. Punishment is befitting of the crime. They come to Joseph, and Joseph doesn't reveal himself at this time, but in chapter 45 he does. You read of Joseph weeping. You read of Joseph weeping for his brothers. And in chapter 45 verse 15 we read of Joseph's brethren speaking to him. Once they make that confession, we're guilty concerning our brothers, that relationship is renewed. That relationship is remade. That relationship is restored. And they enjoy mercy and compassion from Joseph, who, let's not forget, is the governor of Egypt and is the saviour of the world. Zaphnath-Paneah, that's his Egyptian name. So here's the saviour of the world. Here's the governor of Egypt showing mercy and compassion. And now in that right relationship with these men. My friend, this is a picture of the gospel. Here is a picture of the greater than Joseph, Jesus Christ, the one who is sovereign, the one who is not merely governor of this world, but King of kings and Lord of lords. The Bible tells us that he weeps over sin. Whenever he saw the effects of sin in Lazarus in John 11, Jesus wept. Whenever he was going to the cross, he went to the Garden of Gethsemane, and there he wept. Jesus weeps over sin. And Jesus loves you in spite of your sin. And my friend, here in the actions of Joseph, in forgiving his brothers and weeping over sin and showing them mercy and compassion, you have a picture of Jesus Christ. When you confess your sin and your guilt to him, he cleanses, he forgives, he gives mercy. Hebrews 9 tells us that the blood of Christ purges our conscience from dead works to serve the living God. Purges our conscience. Cleanses from all sin. My friend, today, are you struggling with the difficulty of dealing with sin? Jesus Christ, when you confess your sin, he forgives your sin. He forgets your sin. And he remembers your sin no more. Whenever you read of Joseph and his brothers, they lived happily ever after in Egypt. It's a wonderful thing. They lived in harmony and unity together. That relationship was restored once for all, forever. And you can know this with Jesus Christ today. So I trust that in this evangelistic message, and an insight to the conscience, that God will just bless these few thoughts to your hearts and lives this afternoon.